There are games we remember fondly, there are games we forget, and then there are games we lock away with a very particular kind of frustration, disappointment, or distaste. Not because they were bad, but because they left us a feeling like something was missing, something should have been there, something should have been better. For me, Final Fantasy XIII was one of those games. I remember playing it when it was launched on Steam like 11 years ago. I didn't just bounce off it when it came out. I had quite a few issues with its narrative, storytelling style, gameplay mechanics, basically the pacing and the way the story felt like it was sprinting ahead while I was still trying to understand the rules of the world. I hated the way it abandoned the towns, the way it abandoned exploration, the way it felt like a completely different kind of Final Fantasy experience. However, as I mentioned this quite a few times in my previous videos, I'm always quite open for a second chance, for a redemption, so to say. Final Fantasy XIII was one of the few titles that had this chance in 2025. After all these years, I replayed it. Not because the nostalgia suddenly kicked in, and of course not because the community had softened around it. I believe that there is something fascinating about returning to a game you once rejected. Something raw about confronting what you felt then and what you feel right now. The strange thing is that replaying Final Fantasy XIII in 2025 didn't just change my opinion of the game, but it changed how I read its world, its characters, and the kind of story it was always trying to tell. I'm Arcadenaut here, and today we will deep dive into this one of the most unique Final Fantasy experiences that actually carry a heavy storytelling, deep character narratives, and a unique sense of world setting. Because Final Fantasy XIII isn't the game I thought it was. First things first, this deep dive will focus on different aspects of Final Fantasy XIII, from its world setting to narrative, characters, and how this story evolves. So that means either you would find yourself playing Final Fantasy XIII, or you might even find yourself giving it a second chance like I did. When Final Fantasy XIII launched, the world of Cocoon felt sterile, a technologically perfect shell hovering above a hostile planet. Its landscapes were too clean, its architecture too pristine, its cities too organized. Back then, I thought the world lacked soul. I wanted to know more of this mysterious world that was presented to me, rather than complex terms like Fal'Cie, Fal'Cie, Cocoon, and Pulse. This confusion or lack of storytelling might be because of some localization issue, since nearly all of these terms made more sense when I played its Japanese version from start to finish. The simple for that is, all this Fal'Cie or Fal'Cie has Japanese alphabet of kanji next to them, so you get a clearer image what does that term mean in the world of Final Fantasy XIII. The truth is that the problem wasn't the words themselves, but it was the delivery. Final Fantasy XIII throws you into a world that has operated under a very specific system for hundreds of years, and it expects you to understand that system without ever slowing down. Once you peel back the layers, once you stop trying to fit 13 into the mold of a traditional Final Fantasy, and instead look at it on its own terms, the mythology of Fal'Cie and Fal'Cie isn't just a lore, it's the entire spine of Cocoon. So let's start with the Fal'Cie. These beings are not gods. They are not spiritual beings, nor ancient deities, nor mythical creators in the traditional jrpg sense. They are machines. Impossibly powerful, impossibly old, but still machines. They function with purpose, with logic, with cold intent. They provide light, food, water, weather, and infrastructure, and humanity depends on them completely, to the point that people no longer question how anything works. Then you have the Fal'Cie, the unfortunate humans branded as tools by these Fal'Cie, chosen not because they are worthy, but because they are convenient. A Fal'Cie brand isn't a destiny, it is a command issued by something that doesn't feel emotion or understand morality. The command that they receive, which is called focus, isn't a prophecy. It's a task, a directive, and if you complete it, you will be rewarded with eternal crystal sleep. A beautiful way to say your usefulness has ended. Fail the focus and you are transformed into a seed, stripped of your will, reduced to a husk, wandering without meaning, becoming a monster-like creature. It is a horrifying system, and that horror is quiet, subtle, hidden behind Cocoon's fireworks and floating cities. When I replayed Final Fantasy XIII, that contrast hit harder than ever. The mythology that once felt confusing when I was younger now felt disturbingly relevant. Because this isn't a world ruled by mythical gods, but ruled by systems. Namely, systems that demand obedience, systems that decide lives, systems that punish deviation, systems that humanity doesn't question simply because it has grown comfortable. And when the main characters become Fal'Cie, they lose everything. Their freedom, their certainty, their future. They are given a focus they don't understand and punished for not fulfilling a task they never asked for. That's exactly when the game reveals its real theme. Final Fantasy XIII isn't about heroes trying to save the world. It's about people trying to reclaim their freedom, their purpose in a system designed to take it from them. Once I understood that, once I saw how the Fal'Cie manipulate the entire flow of life, how Cocoon's prosperity depends on fear, how the Fal'Cie system strips individuals of their humanity, the story transformed itself for me. It felt more tragic, more deliberate, and unique. And with each step, I felt Final Fantasy XIII growing on me, more than before. All of this raises one major question. Why do Fal'Cie brand humans at all? Why does this cold, mechanical species require Fal'Cie, require focuses, require sacrifice? The answer becomes clear only when you zoom out and look at the broader structure of the world, at the tension between Cocoon Fal'Cie and Pulse Fal'Cie, who are not aligned, not unified, and absolutely not working toward the same purpose. These Fal'Cie are not one coherent race. They don't share a collective will, and they definitely don't stand together philosophically. In fact, they are at war. A silent, ancient, ideological war, a cosmic proxy conflict where higher beings, incapable of acting directly, manipulate humanity as resources and tools. Not out of malice, but because humans possess something the Fal'Cie fundamentally lack. And these are emotion, instinct, and the ability to make choices that break logic. In a universe where these godlike machines cannot exercise true free will, humans become the only pieces on the board capable of triggering outcomes the Fal'Cie themselves cannot reach. Cocoon's Fal'Cie believe in maintaining the structure they built, not for humanity's sake, but to prepare for a catastrophic ritual to summon their god, the Maker. And that ritual demands unimaginable sacrifice. Cocoon must fall for their goal to succeed, and because they cannot perform such an act themselves, they manipulate humans into becoming agents of destruction. Pulse Fal'Cie follow a completely different ideology. They value strength, natural order, and a world shaped by adversity. To them, Cocoon is an unnatural bubble, a place of stagnation that must eventually burst. So their motives collide with Cocoon's, not out of shared cruelty, but out of competing visions for what the world should be. Suddenly, Cocoon's propaganda against Poles makes sense. Suddenly, the fear-mongering, the isolationism, the tightly controlled society all fall into place. These aren't random world-building quirks, they are deliberate mechanisms created by beings who need humans ignorant, compliant, and emotionally malleable. It also transforms how you read Fang and Vanille's role in the story. They are not just Pulse natives, they are survivors of a previous cycle of destruction. People who carry the memory of a catastrophe Cocoon has buried under a myth. Their guilt, trauma, and the secrecy aren't just personal burdens. They are emotional residue from a conflict humanity never understood. Replay Final Fantasy XIII with this in mind, and the entire world shifts. Cocoon stops looking like a paradise and starts looking like a sacrificial altar, a world built with an expiration date. Pool stops being a hellscape and becomes a misunderstood land shaped by a different ideology, and the Fal'Cie themselves stop resembling gods. They become architects of a metaphysical cycle humanity is trapped inside. Once you understand this dynamic, this quiet war shaping every aspect of 13's world, the existence of Fal'Cie becomes painfully logical. The Fal'Cie brand humans because humans are the perfect instruments in a conflict. The Fal'Cie cannot fight themselves. They need emotion, they need unpredictability, they need agents capable of committing acts the Fal'Cie cannot do directly. And when this clicked for me, when I realized that Cocoon's piece is just the surface of a vast ideological machine, everything suddenly aligned. The cycle of branding, the focuses, the punishment, the design of Cocoon itself. And more importantly, it reframed the characters completely. Once the weight of Cocoon's ideology settled in, once the invisible machinery behind the Fal'Cie made sense, the cast stopped looking like a jrpg archetypes and instead felt like human beings reacting to an impossible situation. Their flaws, their contradictions, their emotional spirals, suddenly they weren't just storytelling quirks. They were consequences of a world that has weaponized their existence. And of course, Lightning was the first character to change. When I first played Final Fantasy XIII, I saw her as cold and rigid, almost emotionally hostile. Revisiting the game now, Lightning reads like someone who has built her entire personality around maintaining control in a society that never allowed anyone to question the system. Her distance, her discipline, her sharpness, these aren't traits of a stoic hero, but these are coping mechanisms. They are her armor as she is trying not to break. Replaying 13 with this context makes her growth feel so much more impactful because you finally understand what she's fighting against emotionally, not just physically. Hope's arc also reframed itself in a spot way better than before. Although it was one of my favorites, realizing him reacting exactly the way a teenager would when thrown into a conflict shaped by inhuman forces, he is confused, grieving, desperate for someone to blame, and his story isn't polished or heroic. But in contrast, it's messy, it's contradictory, and human. As that authenticity becomes one of the most grounded emotional beats in 13, especially now that we understand that every character is being crushed by a system that actively strips them of choice. But of course, Snow, Vanille and Fang transformed for me too. Snow needs to believe he can save everyone because the alternative, accepting his failures and his grief, would destroy him. And with Vanille and Fang becoming the emotional anchor of the entire game, once you understand the hidden history, without the context of the Fal'Cie War, they are of course interesting characters, but with the context, they become the narrative heart. Vanille's cheerfulness is no longer naive, it's protective, a mask crafted to suppress centuries of guilt, and Fang's strength on the other hand is no longer simple confidence. It is responsibility hardened by consequences she still carries. These two aren't just survivors of Pulse, but they are survivors of a cycle of destruction that Cocoon has buried beneath a myth. Their dynamic becomes the emotional embodiment of the game's central conflict, that is the weight of history, the fear of repeating catastrophe, and the hope that this time things might end differently. Now, I'll be honest, even after replaying 13 with all of this context, Saz didn't resonate with me the way he does for many fans. I still do believe he's the weakest character of the 13 party, but still, I understand his importance in grounding the cast. I understand how his perspective adds emotional range to the story, and I even appreciate how his arc reflects the fear and responsibility of an ordinary man trapped in extraordinary circumstances. But personally, when compared to the rest of the cast, he didn't connect with me on the same emotional frequency. And you know what? That's okay, because Final Fantasy XIII doesn't rely on single emotional anchor. It's an assembly defined by how each character breaks differently under the pressure of fate they never asked for. And during this replay, what struck me most was how none of these characters act like traditional Final Fantasy heroes. They aren't destined saviors or chosen champions, they are scared people trying to reclaim their autonomy in a world designed to deny it. Final Fantasy XIII stops being a story about saving the world and becomes a story about fighting the system that took their choices away. And that shift in perspective from prophecy to rebellion was what finally made these characters resonate with me in a way they never did before. They are people caught inside a metaphysical machine and desperately trying to escape it. When you talk about Final Fantasy XIII, there is one criticism that always resurfaces: the idea that the game is too linear. It is the discourse that has followed 13 since its launch. The infamous corridor meme, the belief that the game restricts player freedom more than any modern Final Fantasy before it. But here's the thing, for me personally, linearity was never the deal breaker, it was for many players. Back in the day, I wasn't bothered by the narrow paths, the directed pacing, or the lack of traditional towns. I simply accepted 13 as a tightly guided story, almost theatrical in how it moved from one emotional beat to the next. Just like how Final Fantasy X presented its corridors. But what did bother me, both then and especially during my 2025 replay, wasn't the linearity of Cocoon, but the contrast with what happens later. The abrupt shift into Gran Pulse, a massive open area that feels, at first glance, like the exact opposite of everything the game had taught me to expect. Cocoon should feel contained. It is a controlled, engineered society built by entities who fear unpredictability. The corridors, the strict forward momentum, the way environments funnel you toward a single direction, all of it mirrors the lives of people who have never questioned the system that governs them. Even when our party becomes Fal'Cie, that sense of pressure intensifies. You feel trapped because they are trapped. Their fate is a line, not a choice, and the linearity in that sense becomes narrative texture. But Gran Pulse is different. When you finally break free from Cocoon, the game does something bold. It suddenly drops you into a landscape that is overwhelmingly open, wide, empty, and ancient. And this is where my relationship with 13's structure got complicated. The openness of Pulse wasn't liberating for me in the way it clearly was intended to be. Instead, it felt disorienting, not because of its scale, but because of its presentation. For a world this pivotal in the lore, Pulse is strangely quiet, strangely sparse, almost too empty to feel alive. That emptiness made me feel the wasted potential in every cell of my body. Basically, the shift from Cocoon's meticulously crafted corridors to Pulse's vast fields made me feel like I had been transported into a different game with different priorities. Suddenly, the narrative urgency loses its urgency and replaced by optional hunts and exploration that don't carry the emotional weight of what came before. I do understand its intention. Pulse is meant to feel untamed, harsh, a place stripped of societal structure, but I found the execution lacking more than I ever felt before. I wanted to delve further into Pulse, learning more of this wild, uncharted world, but Final Fantasy XIII didn't deliver any methods or narrative elements for me to dig into. And sadly, it is almost ironic. The game many people criticize for being too linear is, for me, actually the strongest in its linearity, because on Cocoon, the structure supports the themes, but on Pulse, the openness sometimes undermines them. There is, sadly, a disconnection between intention and execution. Gran Pulse offers freedom, yes, but in a way that felt detached from the emotional momentum the story had built up to that point. It's a world full of lore, but strangely light on narrative support, full of history but sparse in expression. Revisiting 13 with fresh eyes, I found myself appreciating Cocoon and Pulse in very different ways, and exactly at that point, Cocoon's linearity is, I think, meaningful, as Pulse's openness is symbolic. Emotionally, structurally, and narratively, the transition between them remains one of the most uneven aspects of the game. Not a failure, but a fracture in the game's otherwise tightly controlled storytelling. When I finished my replay of Final Fantasy XIII in 2025, I realized something. Maybe I have changed. The world of Cocoon was still sterile, the Fal'Cie were still merciless, the Gran Pulse was still empty, and the linearity still divided players. But what finally shifted was my understanding of what 13 was trying to say. Beneath the corridors, beneath the mythology, beneath the fractured structure, there was always a story about people trying to reclaim their agency from a system that never saw them as anything more than tools, and maybe that's why this revisit mattered. Because sometimes a game doesn't need to become something new. You just need to grow into the version of yourself capable of hearing what it was saying all along. Final Fantasy XIII isn't perfect, and it never will be. But in its ambition, in its contradictions, in its strange and beautiful attempts at carving a different kind of Final Fantasy, it became something far more human than I ever gave it credit for. So, if you ever dismiss this game like I once did, maybe give it another look. You might not fall in love with it, but you might finally understand it, and sometimes that's enough. And that's my deep dive into Final Fantasy XIII for now. I plan to continue this trilogy, possibly in the upcoming months, and by then, I will share my feelings with you when I finish those experiences and feel ready to convey. As always, thank you for watching today's video. What do you think about Final Fantasy XIII? If there is any other Final Fantasy title you would wish for me to delve further, be sure to share your thoughts by the comments below. Any humble support through Patreon and YouTube join is really appreciated, and I will see you soon by my next video.